Just before I run through the slides, I just wanted to pick up and endorse and maybe just amplify a little a point raised by Neil just now when talking about the balance between autonomy and dignity. One of the things that emerges, one of the points of learning that emerges from my review of safeguarding adult reviews in relation to self-neglect is that too often practitioners are defaulting to Article 8 of the European Convention and now obviously part of UK law as part of the Human Rights Act, the right to private and family life, and failing to consider Article 2, the right to life, and Article 3, the right to live free of inhuman and degrading treatment. And what we know from case law, not least a case known as Re-Z back in, I think, 2004, is that judges will expect practitioners to have conducted a balancing exercise, drawing on the unique circumstances of each particular case in order to determine when there seems to be a misalignment between different human rights, which human right to prioritise or privilege. And that might in some cases be the right to private and family life, but it might in other cases be the right to life or the right to live free of inhuman and degrading treatment. In other words, to prioritise dignity. So it is a message that I think emerges from some of the more recent safeguarding adult reviews. I think the other point to make about autonomy is that we actually need to critically understand what we mean by autonomy, and too often what it appears to mean is that an individual, if an individual says verbally or through their behaviour that they do not wish to engage with us, we walk away, we effectively abandon them to their self-neglect, rather than to continue to express concerned curiosity and continue to attempt to build a relationship of trust with the intention of promoting an individual's longer-term autonomy and self-determination. So just to kind of critically appraise what we understand by that important but at times confetti word. Okay. What I'm going to try and do in the course of the next half an hour or so is to tell you some stories derived from safeguarding adult reviews, from people with lived experience and from research, in order to reinforce what I'm sure you have been covering in the course of the day, to reinforce what we know about best practice with people whose lived experience includes self-neglect. The evidence base is drawn from people with lived experience and what they tell us. It is drawn from safeguarding adult reviews, now over 500 of them, where self-neglect features. It's drawn from research evidence, and it's drawn from the accounts given by practitioners and managers across different services about their lived experience of work. So starting with the voices of people with lived experience, of experts by experience, and I'm starting here not least because of the principle of making safeguarding personal that is embedded hopefully in the Care Act and within adult safeguarding, and it picks up the emphasis that Neil was giving in what I heard to dignity and to Section 1 of the Care Act, which of course is the section about well-being. So here are some contributions from people with lived experience. It's not often that in social work, at least, which is my professional background, we talk about love, but here is someone with lived experience of homelessness and of self-neglect, placing love and by extension, therefore, compassion, empathy, dignity, centre stage in terms of what he felt would help him and perhaps had helped him to deal with the cards that life had given him. The quotation from a Leeds thematic review about homelessness and self-neglect, emphasising the importance of hope and the importance of practitioners and services who go that extra mile, who, to use the phraseology in the quote, roll up their sleeves and get stuck in. The quotation from Mazai's partner, excuse me, emphasising this was covered by Neil to a degree and in the contributions from some of you in the chat, that we need to respond not just to the symptom or the presenting problem, for example, through deep cleans, blitz cleans, decluttering, but we also need to explore what the backstory might be, because if we don't address the backstory when we have removed what is a coping mechanism very often for people, emotional distress will bubble up, to use the phrase given to me by Mazai's partner, and the issues will return. There is almost always a backstory, which is why it's really important to ask questions along the lines of what has happened to you. And an extract from a poem written by an individual who experienced homelessness and self-neglect and alcohol dependence. This is an extract from the poem. You can find the full poem in the reference that is at the top of the slide, and it gives you a very powerful insight into the dangers of assumptions about lifestyle choice. Well, the person could give up drinking if they wanted to, couldn't they? We should never assume that an individual is making a lifestyle choice. Certainly this individual was addicted to alcohol and describes through the poem the descent into that addiction, and indeed what he foresaw as the outcome of it, which indeed is the outcome that came to pass. So what people with lived experience say about working with them, well, none of this will surprise you, will it? They talk about the importance of engagement. They talk about the importance of concerned curiosity, the importance of partnership working with people, the importance of person-centered approaches, thorough assessments that do not make assumptions or demonstrate stereotyping, and being careful about the use of language, because as I heard expressed by Neil and through the chat in the small amount that I was able to listen to, very often people have powerful attachments for whatever reason to possessions, and I am no different. I might not hoard, but I have possessions going all the way back to my childhood, which are exceedingly important for me. They have meaning for me. They give meaning to my life. And were anybody to seek to work with me, it would be important for them to understand the meaning that I attribute to the objects that I have. So we need to see the whole person in their situation. That's what people with lived experience have led me to believe. We need to understand their life journey and to appreciate the losses, the traumas, the adverse experiences that people have had to navigate, and the impact of all of that. And we need to be very careful, therefore, in the two senses of that word, when we intervene, in order to try to understand and make a difference in relation to the backstory that an individual brings, to their encounters with us today. So if that's at least some of what we learn from people with lived experience, there is a wealth of information, of findings, of recommendations from Safeguarding Adult reviews. About 45% of all Safeguarding Adult reviews completed in England since the 1st of April 2015 have focused on self-neglect. It is the most frequently reviewed type of abuse and neglect, which I think highlights the challenges that practitioners and managers face in relation to this part of adult safeguarding. And what we know from Safeguarding Adult reviews, not least from the 45% of them that were contained within the first and so far only national analysis of Safeguarding Adult reviews, is that sometimes self-neglect is not recognised or indeed not seen as a legitimate part of adult safeguarding, despite the statutory guidance that includes it. More often, perhaps, that self-neglect is not understood or explored. There is a lack of concerned curiosity about the backstory, particularly when people refuse assessments, refuse packages of care, refuse treatment from GPs, district nurses, emergency departments and others. There is almost always a backstory that we need time and persistence and sometimes no little courage to explore. We learn that there are shortfalls in relation to the thoroughness of assessments, particularly of capacity and of risk, but also of mental health and support. Common assumptions such as lifestyle choice or indeed a misreading of the Mental Capacity Act along the lines of, well, people have a right to make unwise decisions, don't they? Answer, no, they don't. That is a misreading of Principle 3 of the Mental Capacity Act. A failure to use Section 42 of the Care Act, and a lack of exploration of the different legal options that are available, which is why Neil's slide delineating all of the legal options that might have a contribution to make is so important, and why access to lawyers is part and parcel of best practice. So some common shortfalls found in relation to Safeguarding Adult reviews about self-neglect. And what I'm now going to move on to do is to present an evidence base that looks at what we know is most likely to be helpful when we look at the different components of adult safeguarding. So direct work with the individual, the team around the person, organisational support for the different team members, oversight by the Safeguarding Adult Board, and then the legal policy and financial context set nationally within which adult safeguarding is situated. And the significance of the arrows is to invite you to conduct an appreciative inquiry or a temperature check about whether there is an alignment within across these different elements of the system. You may be familiar with the Swiss cheese model that pictures the cheese that has holes in it, and what you want to avoid in adult safeguarding, in children's safeguarding, in community safety is the holes aligning so that somebody can fall right the way through the block of cheese. In this case, adult safeguarding. You are looking for alignment between the systems that promotes best practice rather than enabling individuals to fall through at some point in the different layers of the system. So this is the evidence base. This will not surprise you. I'm sure you will have heard contributions throughout the day that reinforce the importance of different components of the evidence base. What I'll do is illustrate the evidence base with some of the human stories from Safeguarding Adult Reviews. So we know about the importance of a person-centered approach, about someone keeping in contact with individuals, if necessary, sitting on a doorstep, talking through a letterbox or a window, in an endeavour to show concern and consistency and trustworthiness, such that an individual might, over time, be prepared to engage. We know about the importance of concerned curiosity. What has happened to you? Do you feel safe? Questions that invite a person to reflect on their situation. One service user described that to me, the combination of persistence, a person-centered approach, the keeping on going, the expression of concerned curiosity. When I asked him what had enabled him to begin to address the issues of self-neglect in his case, he said it was the practitioner who kept on asking confrontational questions. So questions that invited the individual to reflect, which the individual could recognise was coming from a position of carefulness in the hyphenated sense of that word. We know about the importance of thorough assessments. We know about the importance of transitions, whether that's young people leaving care, people being discharged from hospital, people being discharged from prison, retirement, unemployment, loss of home. There are transitions, some expected, some unwelcome. These are moments in time where we should endeavour to be putting in place wraparound support for individuals. We know about the importance of thinking family, of assessing, exploring the relationships between people. At least two of the cases that Neil referred to highlight the complicated relationships, the complex relationships that people who self-neglect might be a part of. Not all family relationships, not all social network relationships are supportive. Some can be abusive and neglectful. And we need to think family in that kind of context. So 9 elements of best practice, and hopefully you're already conducting a temperature check and appreciative inquiry, as I hope you have throughout the day, about how close your own practice gets to the 9 components, how close you think your service gets, how close the interagency multidisciplinary architecture gets to the components of best practice. So some Safeguarding Adult Reviews, all in the public domain, all of which highlight different elements of the evidence base. The human stories within this slide deck cover all of the elements of the evidence base, not just direct practice, but in relation to particular components of the evidence base. I've highlighted in bold on this and subsequent slides what these human stories reinforce about the importance of different components of the evidence base. So here, a Salford SAR known as Eric, which highlights the importance of concerned curiosity, trying to engage with Eric about his behaviour, what he was doing, what had happened to him, what wishes, feelings and desired outcomes he wished for himself, and GPs and district nurses highlighting with him, trying to engage in conversations with him about those wishes, feelings and desired outcomes, and what might happen if he continued, as in his case, to refuse food, to refuse water, and to refuse personal care and treatment, particularly from district nurses. And indeed to inquire of Eric's wife and daughter, what they knew about Eric, what light they could shed on Eric that might help GPs, district nurses and others to understand what was happening. The importance, as Neil and subsequently myself have tried to emphasise, about balancing autonomy with dignity or a duty of care, balancing the right to private and family life with the right to life and the right to live free of inhuman and degrading treatment, and the importance in capacity assessments of considering executive functioning or executive capacity, because how a person behaves may be affected by an impairment in the functioning of the mind or brain that may not be immediately obvious, and indeed people's behaviour may contradict what they say about particular decisions. And it also highlights the importance of exploring all legal options and indeed to seeking legal advice in a timely way. Legal advice was sought far too late in Eric's case. A different case, Duncan, somebody with prolonged experience of severe and enduring mental ill health, experiencing dependence on alcohol and other drugs, experiencing also periods of homelessness and of living in hostels that he experienced as unsafe. And here, learning about making safeguarding personal. Duncan was very clear what outcomes he was wishing for, but no service sought to explore with him the feasibility of those outcomes and indeed to seek to attempt to provide the outcome that he was particularly highlighting, which was his own permanent accommodation. Highlights the importance of risk assessment and the quality, the essential quality of risk assessments. And useful though the clutter rating scale is, and I don't dissent from anything that Neil said about the clutter rating scale, there is perhaps a question to be asked of all of you, and that is whether outside of hoarding you have sufficient guidance, sufficient templates or toolkits that would alert you to the kind of risks to assess in particular cases. A thematic review in Haringey, 3 cases involving homelessness and self-neglect, highlighting again the importance of capacity assessments and curiosity, but equally being mindful that there is a statutory right to advocacy. You heard Neil refer to that, Care Act advocacy, Mental Capacity Act, Mental Health Act advocacy, also domestic abuse advocacy, and recognising that not everybody is fluent in writing or in reading in terms of the English language, and that we might need to consider the use of interpreters and indeed to consider how a person's perceived or actual race, culture, religion, language, ethnicity impacts on service providers, the kind of assumptions that might be unconscious but influencing how services respond. In relation to executive functioning, building again on what Neil said that I was able to listen to and what he may have said before I joined this afternoon, there is guidance available about the importance of assessing executive functioning. There is guidance from the Court of Protection in relation to executive functioning, real world observation. Those of you who are occupational therapists or who work closely with occupational therapists in the virtual room today will know that OTs are trained in functional assessments. Don't just tell me, show me, demonstrate, and indeed feeding back what they observe in relation to what a person does. And there are safeguarding adult reviews that have particularly highlighted the importance in capacity assessments of considering executive functioning, not least in relation to people with severe and enduring forms of mental ill health, and indeed people who have prolonged experience of alcohol dependence or dependence on other drugs, and the impact that that can have on the frontal lobe of the brain. So if that's the evidence base in relation to direct practice, there is then the evidence base about the team around the person, how well services work together, share information, communicate, meet in case conference fora, in multi-agency risk management meetings, high risk behaviour panels, complex case panels, whatever they are called in different localities. Cannot emphasise strongly enough the importance of convening the system in order to share information and agree plans in the hope of mitigating risk, and indeed agreeing contingency plans if one's plan of preference does not work out as one would hope. And in complex and challenging cases in particular, being really clear which agency is the lead agency and who the key worker will be to ensure that services collaborate together. And that includes referring adult safeguarding concerns using the provisions of Section 42 and escalating concerns when a local authority is not conducting safeguarding inquiries as a result of cases that you have referred that you believe meet the 3 criteria in Section 42(1) of the Care Act. So again, 9 components of the evidence base for the team around the person. Again, a question for you today and beyond today is how close does your service and do other services get to this evidence base? And if there are obstacles or barriers, what is to be done in an effort to remove those obstacles or barriers? And returning to some of the human stories I've already mentioned, but adding 1 or 2 more, the DUNCAN case illustrates the absence of any multi-agency risk management meeting. Agencies worked in silos, housing did their bit, the CCG as it then was and the Mental Health Trust did their bit, the local authority did its bit, all working on parallel lines, but not coming together to share information, complete assessments of risk, of mental health, of care and support, and with DUNCAN to agree a way forward. A thematic review in Havering involving 2 cases and transitional safeguarding. There were multi-agency and multidisciplinary meetings in relation to both of these young people, young adults, but the plans were insufficient to reduce the risks, and there was insufficient working together outside of those periodic meetings, with the result that in the end, in relation to one of these individuals, the only service continuing to work with that individual was a social worker in adult social care, and in the other case was somebody from a youth offending team. And the thematic review in Haringey, again, reinforcing the importance of multi-agency risk management meetings, and indeed the importance of challenging local authorities when safeguarding concerns are referred, but no safeguarding inquiry is conducted, and it is unclear how the local authority is seeking assurance that no plans, that an individual is being safeguarded. And similarly, in the MS case, the local authority made what I concluded was 2 unlawful decisions in relation to referred adult safeguarding concerns. but no one challenged the local authorities' decision making. There were no multi-agency risk management meetings in MS's case, and crucially, services did not agree how to approach mental capacity assessments in MS's case. And there was one example of 4 practitioners from different professions and different services all standing at a bus stop in Hackney at precisely the same time in order to establish whether MS had capacity to make decisions about treatment for his physical and mental health. They could not agree whether or not MS had capacity at that point in time for those decisions. And so they left him at the bus stop, and he died at the bus stop before the assessment could be recommenced. What would have been best practice in that case was for the team around the person to agree who was the lead practitioner in relation to the decision that was the focus of that capacity assessment. And adult N, an individual alcohol dependent, experiencing homelessness, experiencing self-neglect, assumptions about lifestyle choice, insufficient curiosity about the backstory, but again in bold, because I'm focused here on the team around the person, the absence of multi-agency risk management meetings, services not working together, for example, when adult N was in an emergency department or indeed admitted onto a hospital ward, the lack of outreach and indeed agreement between mental health and substance misuse services about how they were going to work jointly in this particular case. And again, adult safeguarding concerns referred, but no Section 42 inquiry or other mechanism designed to prevent or to mitigate existing risks of self-neglect. 6 components of organisational support for different members of the team. And here I think the question for you to take away and reflect on is who looks after you. This work can be scary. It's almost always challenging. It's not infrequently complex and complicated. It requires persistence and, as I've said, on occasions, no little courage. Who looks after you? What is the quality of supervision and support that you receive? What is the quality of management oversight? Not just of your decision making, but management oversight to prepare you for engagement and indeed to debrief you afterwards. What opportunities do you have beyond today to engage in what we might call workforce development? And do you have an experience that, having gone on training and having had opportunities like today, you go back to your workplace and you wonder how the hell you are going to implement the knowledge that you have acquired or the skills that you have acquired, because the workplace does not appear to be aligned to enable you to deliver what we know to be best practice. And if there are gaps in provision, are commissioners engaged with you as providers in exploring what the gaps are and how those gaps in provision might be remedied? And lastly, do you have unfettered access to specialist advice, whether that be legal or safeguarding or about mental capacity and mental health? And again, safeguarding adult reviews, it reinforced the importance of this part of the evidence base. The DUNCAN case in Croydon, questioning how well supported practitioners and operational managers felt. Again, staff support prominent in a Havering review, a different Havering review known as MS-A. But the leaving care worker in particular went above and beyond to support MS-A as a young person navigating leaving care. How well supported was she to keep on going with Mzee, and indeed when Mzee jumped out of a window and died of her injuries, how well was that practitioner supported subsequent to Mzee's death, which was quite traumatic, as I'm sure you can appreciate. Gaps in services, very evident in the other safeguarding review for Haringey. As I've said, a transitional safeguarding issue. It was not clear how commissioners and providers were exchanging information to identify gaps in provision and what might be done locally in relation to those gaps, and where those gaps were a result of the impact of government decisions, not least financial austerity, how those issues were going to be escalated to the Department of Health and Social Care. And then lastly, agencies and safeguarding adult boards very often produce policies and procedures, and very often that includes a list of the legal rules similar to the list that Neil put up in the slide, and yet there is a lack of familiarity in relation to policies and procedures. Do we not have time to familiarise ourselves with policies and procedures? Do we have too many policies and procedures? Are they too unwieldy to use? You may have a variety of experiences in relation to the usability, if I can use that word, of policies and procedures. Howard, an Isle of Wight review highlighting a particular gap, the provision of or the non-provision of a wet hostel, both on the Isle of Wight and indeed a shortage of similar provision on the mainland. And then lastly, in terms of the evidence base, 6 components of what a good safeguarding adult board will be doing. And I'm sure if you go onto the Manchester Safeguarding Adult Board website, you will see components of this evidence base, similarly in Salford and elsewhere in the Greater Manchester region. Familiarise yourselves with what is on the Safeguarding Adult Board's websites, not least the Safeguarding Adult Reviews that are published by Manchester, Salford and indeed other Safeguarding Adult Boards in the Greater Manchester area. Familiarise yourself with the findings and ask yourself, could this happen here? And if it couldn't happen here, where are the enablers that would prevent it happening? And if it could happen, what are the obstacles or the barriers to service improvement that the Safeguarding Adult Board needs to do something about? And all of this operates in a national context. I've highlighted financial austerity. There are also, in my view, gaps in the legal rules, not least the absence in England, but not in Wales and Scotland, of an adult safeguarding power of entry. I also think that the Care Act was not designed, particularly the list of eligible needs were not designed with people who self-neglect, people who are dependent on alcohol and other drugs, people who are homeless in mind. So it may well be that we have an incomplete architecture in order to meet the needs of many of the individuals that you will be working with. And in some crucial respects, government policies pull against each other. The Department of Health and Social Care through the Care Act will encourage us to meet people's needs. We have a duty to meet eligible needs, a power to meet other care and support needs. But the Home Office and the hostile environment, not least in relation to people with no recourse to public funds, pulls at least to some degree in a different direction. Adult safeguarding is political. I make no apology for emphasising the word political with a small p, and all of us involved in adult safeguarding need to call out what we believe to be the unhelpful aspects of the context within which we are having to work. I think I've just about completed that within the time that was allocated to me. If you find the slides useful, please by all means use them if you wish. If there's time, I'm happy to answer questions. And should you need to or wish to, this is how you get hold of me. Thank you for listening. But in addition, thank you for the work that you do. It may not always be obvious that you are making a difference, but if it wasn't for you, the lives of many people would be significantly worse than they are in the midst of a pandemic and a cost of living crisis. So thank you for the contributions you make to adult safeguarding.